I'm delighted to welcome you to the final session for the day with such an impressive and varied lineup. I mean, I'm so proud that we managed to pull this panel together. But I'm not going to introduce this impressive panel, actually. I will introduce you to the host for the next hour, Professor Martin Gibson. Now, Martin wears so many different hats, so I will try and give his introduction a little bit of a try. He is my clinical other half for the Business Development and Marketing Directorate at the NIHR Clinical Research Network Coordinating Center. He is the Clinical Director for NIHR Clinical Research Network Local Clinical Research Network in Greater Manchester. And he's also the Chief Exec of Northwest eHealth. Martin, on a personal level, is actually what I call a clinical research guru. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Gibson.
Thanks very much, Divya. That was a really nice introduction. And I'm pleased that you said I was your clinical other half. We could have had a bit of a problem there. So I also am going to introduce the panel in a minute. They're mainly going to introduce themselves. But I do want to tell you that we don't just sling these things together here at the NIHR. We plan things with scrupulous attention to detail. So there have been a series of meetings arranged, Zoom, Teams meetings, so that I could brief the panel precisely on what we're going to talk about. And I want you to know that the panel all duly turned up for that meeting, and I missed it. So if things go slightly pear-shaped, it's probably my fault. So we've got a glittering panel, as Divya has said. So on my left, Kate Bingham, and then Claire Grace, June Rain, Matt Whitty, and Dinesh Saralaya. And they are all going to introduce themselves because I will mix up all of their different titles and everything else that they do. They're then going to give just a couple of minutes on something that I think we've prepared, but we'll just see how it goes. And then after that, I'm going to ask them some more specific questions. And then we're going to hand over to you guys and hopefully get a lot of questions from the floor. Because we want this to be as interactive as possible. So, and feel free to ask difficult questions, because if you don't, it has to be me that asks those difficult questions. And I have a few lined up, but if you could think of some really hard ones for afterwards, that would be great. So with no further ado, if I could introduce Kate, if you would like to say a few words about yourself, and then plow on with a couple of minutes worth of where we're at.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. So I'm Kate Bingham. You may know that I headed up the Vaccine Task Force last year for what ended up being 7 months, although I'd originally only committed to 6. And when I spoke to the Prime Minister, he said, I need you to get vaccines as soon as possible for the UK. They don't need to be perfect, but they need to be quick. So that actually, by and large, worked incredibly well. I'd spent the last 30 years developing therapeutics based on emerging science and building biotech companies both here in the UK, but on the continent and in the US. So my background is all about translating novel science into therapeutic modalities, small molecules, antibodies, now gene therapy, cell therapy, and all the new modalities. I've got a particular focus, obviously, because I'm based in the UK, but I also think, and especially think so now, based on my experience at the Vaccine Task Force, that clinical research is probably the single greatest asset that we have in the UK as far as developing new medicines and, of course, vaccines. Now, I'm a novice to vaccines, so I understand medicines better than vaccines. But the fact is, and I think the spotlight was really shone on the UK last year, was just quite how quickly we could get trials set up, designed, and executed. And of course, that largely goes down to June, but obviously lots of the PIs and all the different people running studies around the UK. And that, I think, has been a catalytic event that allows us now to really capitalize on this and to show that we can do those early first-in-man, human person trials quickly here, but also that we can extend the whole way through pharmacovigilance. And again, if you compare us to other countries, I don't think there are many other countries that are as joined up as we are being able to get trials set up, run, and then we can continue to watch the real-world evidence of how those trials actually perform and how the different drugs or vaccines perform. So I'm back to my day job and enjoying life back to as it was, but now hoping to really capitalise on some of the real excellence that we have in the UK.
And just before we move on, it says at the end of my little bit I was supposed to summarise. Well, I don't think I can summarise that. The summary is we've done an amazing job. We can learn a lot from what we've done and try and apply that in the future. The panel, hopefully, in the way we've got it structured, I should have said this at the beginning, will take you through all the different expertise that we have across the board and how we can stitch it together. So we've already heard from Kate how we've done the vaccine work, and it's been, the rapidity of it and the scale of it has been incredible. And that's one of the things I think we want to try and pick up, because I'm going to ask Claire now, who will introduce herself, but it'll become very relevant why it's very important from your point of view, from a global perspective, as in the CRO industry.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Hi, everybody. My name's Claire Grace, and I'm Chief Patient Officer at Parexel, which is a large international CRO. And I've worked in the industry for the last 25 years, originally in pharma biotech, and then moved halfway through my career into the CRO world, and originally in sort of molecular oncology drug development. I've worked for the last probably 10 years in key stakeholder relations and management, so that's really working really closely with clinical research sites and patients and patient advocacy organisations to really improve research at the grassroots level, not just on a national scale but internationally with many different groups across the world. And obviously being a Brit and playing on that international stage very often in the US, I find it incredibly frustrating how frequently the UK is overlooked. The huge assets that we have here within our data particularly, but our research infrastructure that is completely integrated into the care structure, something that is new and novel in the US and they're desperately trying to build. We've had that for forever. Well, for as long as the NHIR has been in place. And so I'm very passionate about sharing the word globally on that global stage about just what we can do in the UK. And I think now we have a real opportunity. We're hopefully on the downward turn of the pandemic, and we're able now to really look at some of the great things that we did during the pandemic and really drive those forward and incorporate those into the everyday to really boost the UK on the international scale. There is great competition out there. There's huge competition from the US, but there's huge competition from countries like South Korea as well. Phenomenal infrastructure over there. 4 of the top oncology sites for volume of oncology research sit in Seoul, in Korea. You know, that's huge. So it can be done. They weren't there 25 years ago. We have that opportunity to take that stage. We're going to take it. So thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And I think we're going to come back to you in a little while and ask you a bit more about the challenges that there are globally and what we can do perhaps in more detail and what we're doing well and perhaps what we could improve on. If I could move on to June, who basically runs all the regulatory side of things, and
Just.
single-handedly, I'm sure, to give us that regulatory view and where we think there have been learnings from within the pandemic and the COVID side of things, but also what that teaches us about what we can do better in the future, perhaps.
Well, thanks very much, Martin, and hello, everyone. I'm June Raine. I'm the CEO at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And I think, as we're all really feeling, the clinical trials sector has come into its own during this period, and its value is enormously important, not just to patients, the health service, but to UK PLC. You don't often hear the words exciting and regulator in the same sentence, but I'm going to say them. It has really been such an exciting roller coaster. And what it has meant for us as regulators is stopping being watchdogs or policemen and becoming enablers. What does that actually look like? And I think it's 3 things in particular. First is the proactivity and the pace, that you can actually get an early phase trial up and running in 7 days with some pre-assessment. And that's what we did for the COVID studies. That you can look at the other particular later stages and actually, again, do pre-assessment and get things quickly moving, perhaps using something like CPRD to help recruitment. So it's all about putting the pace into getting things moving. The second thing I think has really been an amazing achievement is the level of collaboration and partnership working. We dreamed of these things, but they were never realised until that model was set, Vaccine Task Force. But now partnership working and collaboration is systematic, it's everyday, it's routine. And I think the last bit, again, not normally said of a regulator, is being innovative in the processes. So you may have already heard about our innovative licensing and access pathway, rejoicing in the acronym ILAP, that is meant to deliver end-to-end, just as our mission has been from the asset through the deployment, discovery, development, deployment, so that we see an end-to-end pathway right through to the patient. And our role in that, yes, can only be delivered with others, HTA, NHS, working with devolved administrations. But it's now doable. So let's all make the exceptional every day. That's where we are now.
Thanks, June. And I think it's fair to say that globally the MHRA is seen now as a leader in this area, quite rightly. And maybe we can come back to talk about that in a little while. Passing on the baton to Matt, I think June has sort of nicely passed on to you, because if we get all the regulatory stuff right and we show that the drugs work and they're safe, we still have to actually get them into everyday practice and use them. And maybe you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Matt Whitty. I'm the Director of Innovation, Research and Life Sciences at NHS England. And I'm also the Chief Executive of the Accelerated Access Collaborative that we host. And that also follows on nicely from June's point about that collaborative approach. So at the AAC, we've got a really unique opportunity in that we've got all of the key players around the table to help address these big challenges. So we've got the MHRA, we've got other government departments, we've got patient groups, and we've got the NHS. And what we're really focusing on is what are the big transformational things that we can do that will actually get the best treatments and diagnostics to patients faster. And just kind of reflecting on the pandemic over the last 18 months, there's sort of two areas that really stand out from a research perspective. When you look at what the recovery trial has achieved over the last 18 months, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, this has saved, millions of lives all over the world. And if you look at the delays that would have otherwise been in place if they had gone through sort of a normal trial route, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of lives that would be lost to that. So it's that we're focusing on in trying to reduce that time as well. So we're working really closely with NIHR and with the Department of Health on the UK Vision for Clinical Research. And on a practical basis, what this means is that actually research information and the status of research trials, that's routinely now being shared with execs at NHS England. So we're really sort of sharing, where are the services up and running and how does that link in with the research agenda, as well as much more practical things around how can we work together to reduce the time it takes to get set up. So I think the recovery trial was single days, to get the trial signed off to the first patient being recruited, when probably everyone in this room knows better than me, it's more than 200 days normally. So again, we've really got to kind of work together to get that down because of the impact. I think the second is more around sort of a cultural change that we've seen over the last year to do with research. We know that hospitals that are research active tend to provide better care. And we've also seen that throughout the pandemic, particularly with recovery, and there are many other trials as well, is that staff really saw undertaking research and being aware of research as a key part of delivering good quality clinical care. It was really clear that the link between undertaking this research, we were going to use science and research to research our way out of the problems that we were facing. And I don't want that to just be something that we lost to COVID. I want that something to be that we completely embed into all of our work. And again, we've got strong support from ministers, we've got strong support from all of the executive leadership at NHS England, and also across all of the AAC partners to deliver that as well. Isn't that right, June?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I know locally in Manchester that a lot of our district general, medical directors, junior staff, actually people have seen the research have an impact in front of their eyes. And it's had a dramatic impact on how they think about research. It was always seen as, well, that's something somebody else does in a teaching hospital. It's not like that anymore. And I think the same is true for patients. I think patients have seen that as well. And many of them, of course, have joined up with the vaccine registry and other things that we might want to come back to. So thanks for that. But kind of at the cold face of all of this, are people actually doing the everyday research and actually having to be the principal investigators and deliver those vaccine studies and do everything else. And of course, Dinesh can tell us a little bit more about that hope.
Thanks. So I'm Dinesh Saralaya. I'm a respiratory physician by background and started on my journey in the city of Bradford, which I can assure you is not only famous for its curry, it has some of the highest incidences of chronic respiratory disease. So early in my career, it was my passion to bring cutting-edge treatment in asthma to the population where it's most needed. And over the years, grew it to become one of the most successful clinical trials units in the UK. But then we had this dreadful name, COVID-19, come to us in early last year. And I had the dubious distinction of also becoming the first clinician to see the first COVID patient in Bradford. But I must commend the NIHR, and that's when I met Divya and Phil Evans, to have set up this group as the Urgent Public Badging Committee, UPH as we called it, and where we prioritize the COVID research. And I think a huge thank you has to go to the NIHR as well as the NHS organizations who took part in that. And we seem to be the driving force. Through that, I was very active and involved in recruiting into many of the COVID-19 treatment trials. But before COVID, we had also set up our ambition in Bradford to become a patient recruitment center. Unfortunately, COVID consumed that award and the good news that we had about that. But we continued the good work along with the other 4 other patient recruitment centers into delivering a big footprint into the vaccine trials and the treatment trials across the country to enable the licensure of these vaccines as well. So yeah, so the cutting, I also have the experience of actually how to recruit some of these patients, and in the post-COVID world, some of the challenges that we face as well. As if somebody had alluded earlier, today, it's not business as normal, but the new world on how we're going to carry out research, that we engage and take it to the populations where it's most needed.
Thanks, Dinesh. So I think you've now got an idea of just the scope that this panel represents in front of you and how glittering they are. But I'm going to come back to Claire, actually, if that's all right, and maybe we could dig a little bit more into the global challenges and where the UK is and where we want to be and how we get from where we are to where we need to be or where we aspire to be. Could you maybe fill that out a bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you look at where we are today now, when I entered the industry, we had a really weak pipeline as an industry. And we don't today. We have a phenomenal pipeline. But in the last 18 months, what we've also done is we've added on the COVID vaccines, and then we've added on COVID treatment, and now we're looking at long COVID as well. So that pipeline that we have now is huge. And yet the global research infrastructure, the numbers of physicians that are actually conducting research has not changed at all in the last 20 years. So what we have is this phenomenal funnel that we have to drive all of this work through in order to get our products at the end. And I think that is our single biggest challenge facing the industry at the moment. And you can see that starting to take effect now with the skills shortages that we're seeing in all areas. We're seeing more nurses leaving nursing than ever before. And that's on a global scale. It's not just in the UK. We're seeing research infrastructure moving out of sites, and we're seeing a skills shortage in industry as well. And so I think it's really, one thing that's really critical is that industry doesn't just suck up all of that nursing resource and then we drain the site capacity and the investigator capacity. But that's one of the biggest challenges we've got at the moment as an industry. And so when you look at that research infrastructure and where to place your trials and where you're placing your bet in terms of trying to get that trial done really quickly and effectively, but with high quality at the same time, it really is a global playing field. And obviously, some of the key things, some of the key metrics that we work with in the industry, honestly, the biggest indicator of trial length is recruitment period. We all know that. A trial's completely dependent, the length of it, on how long it takes to recruit. But what you might not know as well is there's really key indicators of that. So actually, it also relates back to how long it takes a trial to set up and how long it takes for a site to recruit a patient once that trial is established at site. Those indicators show that if you are a site that sets up quickly, if you are a site that recruits quickly after your initiation visit, you are going to be one of the bigger recruiters. You're going to be one of the better recruiters. So those are the indices that we're looking at, the indicators that we're looking at when we're placing studies. And the biggest competition we have is obviously from the US, because they have faster regulatory timelines and pathways than we have at the moment. But also, as I mentioned before, at some of the newer markets, like, Asia, we look at, South Korea, Australia have some phenomenal incentives for research, both within the timelines, but also from sort of tax incentives and that sort of thing, as we do as well here. But it's really important that we understand as, UK PLC, that there's competition. There's competition to bring this, not only this investment into the country, but also, to really get these new treatments to patients as quickly as possible. I think the biggest asset that we have is the fact that we have the NIHR that's integrated into care, so we can actually access patients much more easily. The biggest challenge the US have is their disparate care system. It's a huge challenge when trying to understand who the patients are, where they are, what their comorbidities are, and really just collate that data. So there's a lot of benefits we have. I think the biggest challenge, Martin, at the moment is that we're just not out there enough on the global stage expressing what we are capable of and what we can do. And I think over the last 18 months we've really showed that, haven't we? I mean, what a phenomenal example of what can be done when we all pull together and we use all of the capabilities that we have as a country. But I think we need to do more of that, and what we must do to play on that global stage is we absolutely must capitalise on what we've learned. We must build upon the positives. We must learn from the challenges that we had and drop the things that don't work so well, and go forward into the future with new concepts, as I know you're bringing forward with the iLab. But I do think it's really important that we're able to really establish ourselves on that global stage with new ways of working.
So it is very competitive. We're often not seen as the place to do later phase trials. We're seen as a place that's really good at academic research, really good at early phase research. I think there is a challenge, maybe one of you will want to make some comments on this, about the fact that we're very good at evaluating drugs, but we then don't buy them. Yeah. And that's a bit of a problem in the industry. We need to think about how we push the pathway right through into implementation. I think the infrastructure side is really important, but June's already said, and Matt, that we've set up studies much quicker in the pandemic, and we need to learn from how we do that, because it's all about time. Time is money, time is everything, time is patent life. So one of the initiatives around that, of course, is to try and improve what we're doing in later phase research, and maybe think about different types of trial as well that we can do in the UK, such as distributed or disseminated trials. I wonder, Dinesh, if you can expand on those aspects.
I think from Martin, COVID taught us lots of lessons. So as I alluded to, urgent public health and the way we oversaw the entire portfolio as well as prioritized studies. If you look at the PRC concept, again, the rapid setup, the unified costing that we do. In fact, Blackpool got the world's first patient on the Novavax vaccine trial. That was also a huge accolade to the PRC, but the concept of the PRC, but the individual efforts from that particular center. But not only did that do, the 3 PRCs in the Novavax trial, just to give you an example, recruited 1 in 7 patients into that trial. And that number was 15,000, for example. So 2,000 patients on that trial came from the 3 PRCs. And the study setup times for those trials, so for example, I can talk about Bradford. We had our site documentation on the 15th of September and recruited our first patient on the 6th of October. So that is the sort of speed that you deliver. So, but also, if you then translated it into the point that you make, Martin, into further studies, what the PRCs and the other organizations could learn from COVID is that selling that UK PLC, the ease of bringing a trial to the UK, but more importantly, feasibility, selecting the right sites. And I think there is also a plea to industry here, is to have a responsible CI who would have those conversations, and I'm sure some in this audience who have worked with me know that the way they work with me, is having those conversations and setting up that feasibility along with the discussions with the people who they think will deliver that target. And the processes that are in place have never been better than before. The PRC concept, as well as if we could then translate it to the other centers, the speed of setup, the unified costing template and the higher target, but as well as with regards to June, the quality, which is very important. And the UK, whenever I've done respiratory trials, the one thing which stands out, which we don't have a placebo effect, which we will see in many Eastern European countries, the strength of our recruitment is the quality that we maintain. And the speed, if we can then bring speed and easy access to centers, I think there's nothing preventing us to be on par with the US with the number of trials that we can do. And I think COVID should teach us that, and the experiences of the vaccine and the COVID treatment trials will translate into the other trials going forward.
I mean, that's a very positive thing, as long as we can translate it, isn't it? But I mean, you can't do any sort of recruitment into trials unless you can get participants. And sort of, I think there's been an increased public awareness of what we've been doing over the pandemic, obviously. But how, can we capitalize on that? I mean, I think we've known for a while that pre-consenting people to be approached directly about research works very well. Joint dementia research is an example of that. But of course, one of the things we created to get us off the blocks with the vaccine side of things was the vaccine registry. I wonder, Kate, whether you can expand on how that works, what we might do with that in the future, what extensions of that there might be for getting more public engagement in research.
Well, first of all, I should call out Divya for I don't call it the vaccine registry, I call it the NHS registry, because when we were talking at the steering group about how we could accelerate the clinical development, Divya said, well, we need to have a big pool of pre-consented people, so that our offer to the different vaccine companies was to say, not only will we help you with scale up and manufacture and fill finish, but we'll also help get the trials set up and then recruited very quickly. So Divya said, what we need is a national registry, and I said, it sounds like a great idea, how do we do it? I won't tell you all the backstories about how Divya did it, but it was not trivial, I might say. But the result is we've got over 500,000 people who've signed up on the NHS website, 94% of which have said they would be willing to be consented about trials beyond vaccines. So that's a massive plus, because of course, in the back of our minds was, yes, we want this for vaccines and we want this yesterday, but we need to make sure that this is a durable, ongoing capability that we can use for the UK. So I think where we can get this to is working with charities and patient advocacy bodies, I mean, everything from sort of CRUK to some of the big BHF and so on, so that anybody with a diagnosis can sign up onto that registry and just see, are there any trials that might be suitable for me, so that it's not limited, patients joining trials are not limited to actually being patients from the specific PIs who are running the studies. And that's where I think we need to get to, such that the UK is a national clinical trial pool. And then again, linking back to clinical records and then going back to the pharmacovigilance that we can do, that is a very compelling offer to industry. Not only can we run your study quickly, but we've got then the means to evaluate the real world efficacy and safety of these therapeutics and vaccines. So that's what I would like to see with my venture capital hat on, is that this turns into a reality. So it goes beyond just volunteers for vaccines, but goes across therapeutic areas, especially in those clinical areas where we have deep expertise. And so you mentioned dementia research. I mean, that's a great idea of how can we actually get more people into these studies with now novel biomarkers. I don't want to put June on the spot about whether or not MHRA will
but you are going to put her on the spot.
But that is the sort of thing that's exciting. If you've really got that richness of data, can you approve on the back of biomarkers as opposed to clinical survival or clear clinical endpoints?
Thanks, Kate. I mean, I'm sure June's going to allude to that when she responds in a minute. But actually, through our network infrastructure every year, we get about, I don't know, I'm going to get this wrong now, so somebody's going to correct me, about 800,000 people a year, something like that. And these are all people that have volunteered to be part of research across the NIH CRN. We need to capture all those people because, and we don't currently, into these consent for approach. Because one thing I can tell you as a clinical researcher, that the person most likely to be part of the next research program is the person that was part of a previous one, because it's such a good experience for most people. It's a very exciting, interesting thing to do. If the research team is doing it properly, as most people do, you feel very special, I think. Is that right, Dinesh? I mean, I think you'll find people feel special to be part of it, so they should feel special.
Absolutely. I think when the vaccine registry was set up, I was also a consultant on some of that. The enthusiasm that we have from those participants, remember, for a clinician, to keep a patient through a trial is really important. Patient retention, for us to be a very good country in conducting trials, patient dropout rate is the key. If you don't have a patient dropout, it all boils down to patients' enthusiasm in taking part of trials. I was talking to one of, in a personal conversation, I've got patients who have taken part in their 7th and 8th trial with me. So patient retention comes from that interest and that loyalty and the trust that they have. And there it comes to individuals who lead the trial within the centers, but also from the reputation that comes from registries that is trying to recruit patients. And I think we need to, learning in the post-COVID era, it won't be a bad idea for individual specialties to set up registries in their own areas where they think. So for example, Martin, in your area, diabetes, you already have a big registry. But we don't have registries in COPD or asthma. It's just in very rudimentary stages, where we can quickly tap into that data, match the inclusion criteria across those registries and recruit patients.
But Dinesh, I would slightly take issue with that, because I think if you have a series of separate registries, that actually misses the point of the fact that, you know, as we get older, we have multiple comorbidities. So I much prefer everybody to use the central, not vaccine, central NHS registry, and then they put in their different healthcare diagnoses and tests, and you can then get within that your sub-registries for diabetes, heart disease, COPD.
Martin said he liked controversies.
I agree with you.
Can I just take that one step further?
No.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course you can.
I will. You know I will, Martin. Absolutely. But I don't want you looking in that registry and you looking in that registry. I want one central person to look in it, because as much as I want my CRA to come and have a lovely conversation with you for an hour up in Bradford, I'd really much rather use that resource more efficiently, because we don't have a lot of it, and have somebody in the central place looking across all of the UK and understanding exactly where the patients are and going straight to them. I should come to you and tell you how many patients I think you have, not the other way around.
I knew that my panel was going to be able to Can I make a point? I'm going to take executive action here. So we run not a registry, we run a consent for approach system in the Manchester area, which covers multiple therapy areas. And I'm going to put in a plea here for the regional research networks, because it's not just knowing, nationally it's a bit remote, but you can have a national system with a local flavour, yes, where you know who the people are, you know where they could participate, and you've got to maintain this group. You've got to give them information, you've got to let them know what's happening. It's actually quite hard to do, to keep that engagement and excitement.
It's hard, but it's not rocket science, actually. So if you look at what you need to do, you need to recruit 1, 2, 3 people to constantly be writing newsletters and updates, and this is what we've achieved, and based on your participation, this is what we've been able to do, and this is the data we've generated. It's not impossible to do,
Emma,
and it's not that expensive.
And if you get the access to the right people, those people will be contacted for studies. And so that keeps them engaged more than anything else.
Okay, so, right, guys. We all agree this is what we want to do. William, taking notes? Excellent. Good. Thank you very much. June, I wonder if I could come back to you. So there's a lot of these challenges are going to come your way from a regulatory perspective. We're going to do everything faster. We're going to, but we've got to maintain the quality. What about the sort of trial design side of things? What about what can we do with all this data that we have? What can we do differently? What's the appetite for doing that from a regulatory perspective?
Absolutely. And in fact, this has been something we've been talking about, going to conferences to talk about for quite some time. But I think, as we heard from Matt, when you think about recovery and the platform design, it works. And I would like to touch on, Dinesh, your point about quality. One of the most vivid recollections of the whole exercise was when the FDA decided to map every trial and rank countries around the world. Of course, I was avidly waiting. Where is the UK? Nowhere. And then they ranked trials for quality and actionable outcomes. And there we were. And it got to a stage during the pandemic that I'd be getting regular contact from the FDA commissioner, what's happening in recovery. And that tells you what this country can do for quality. So innovation, yes, of course there's a tool in iLab that actually builds in the capacity to look at innovative designs early on as we put together a bespoke development pathway. And I would urge companies to have a go at this. And the fact that it will produce actionable data for the regulator and for HTA will make Matt's job a lot easier too. So let's look at things in innovative ways. We're ready to do this. It's a mature setup thanks to NIHR, and what we hear from the patient perspective and the registry is absolutely inspiring. So there should be, if you like, a COVID bounce now. We should really bounce into the new era of innovative designs.
And I might just add to that in terms of the examples. So in the case of vaccines, the FDA put some absolute lines in the sand saying we will not accept vaccines unless they have 50% efficacy, and a whole bunch of different things which was their requirements for vaccines for them to consider approving them. And yet with the MHRA said we're not going to put lines in the sand, we're going to evaluate each vaccine and data set as they come through, and we'll work with you right from the beginning. So this whole concept of rolling review was something that has never been seen before. It's like sort of half-written homework. You know, give us your essay plan and we'll look at that, and then when you've done your first paragraph, then we'll look at that, and we might give you a few clues as to what we'd like to see in the rest of it. And so it meant that by the time you actually had the data, you could just drop those into the data tables, you know, the statistical analysis, all the things had already been pre-agreed. And that was noticeably different compared with other regulators. So again, I think this is, with our UK hat on, a massive competitive advantage. And we don't seek to replicate and repeat the analysis of the data that's been proposed, just as the FDA does. So that means we can do it quicker. And I think the fact that June and her team were able to approve the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine before any other regulator in the world, even when we were not running the trials in this country, is a phenomenal outcome. And that does show that this ability to embrace and work with companies at an early stage and constructively is an incredibly positive thing. So thank you.
Well, it's moved from disseminating into... The word is dialogue, and it has got to be active engagement, pulling things through. And the regulator's in a privileged position because we see it all. And we can make these judgments, and without imposing, retaining independence, can stimulate, you know, the appropriate decisions being made. So you've done it, everybody here.
So I think you're getting a lot of passion from the panel, and I can feel it coming back from the audience as well. We have done an amazing job, so you've applauded us, but I think actually you should be applauding yourselves. I'm going to ask Matt the hard question. We've talked a lot today about data and the sources of data in the UK. We've talked maybe a little bit about how we might use those for regulatory purposes as well. Where does that fit into the whole scheme from your point of view? And are we getting as much out of that as we should or could?
I think we're starting to, and I think that it's really interesting hearing Claire's point earlier about how much of a global marketplace this is for trials. And one of the things that we do, one of the things that I do in my day job is work really closely with our commercial teams at NHS England to work on the big transformational deals. So when we see things coming through, like many of you may be familiar with the GRAIL Galleri cancer test or the inclisiran deal, when we talk about these big transformational deals, they often have a research element to it, and so we're selling the UK data assets as part of that deal. So it's not just about sort of the clinical efficacy, it's not just about the price that we can drive, or the innovative commercial models, or the cost effectiveness, or the affordability, or any of those things. It's a broader conversation that we're having in these discussions. What research is going to be undertaken in the UK? Where's it going to be done? Where's the supply chain? Where's the manufacture? Where's that going to be in the UK? As well as sort of the uptakes and the implementation support. So it's a much more rounded package, and the data assets are a really key part of that as well.
Yeah, because the data just doesn't tell you, well, we've heard earlier today about find, recruit, and follow up. And of course, that's very much about the trials aspects of that. But of course, the NHS data is much broader than that, much greater than that, and then increasingly we're adding social care data to this. So you can actually start to look very much from an HTA perspective at the cost effectiveness and how you would implement that at a population level. So we can get to that place where we do the research, we have the ideas, we do the research, we implement it, and we buy whatever it is that works. And I think that the NHS can, should, must do all of those things. My panel have been amazing.
Just on that as well,
Yeah.
sorry, get everyone else is jumping in on things. I thought it might be worth a point as well. I mentioned the inclisiran deal. It's really interesting because that's just been NICE approved this week. So it's a new lipid lowering therapy that was originally developed by a company called the Medicines Company, so a smaller pharmaceutical company. They worked really closely with researchers in the UK on pragmatic trial design, digital identification of patients, and they were able to do the randomization much more cheaply for a large scale trial. That drug probably would not have made it to market without pragmatic randomized control trial. It just would not be available, and it's just been NICE approved. It's part of a big deal, and it's got potentially going to have a very big reach and a very big impact on cardiovascular disease, on health inequalities, and it just is unlikely it would have made it to market with it going through the traditional route as well. So it's those kind of prizes that we're aiming for.
Yeah. Sadly, I know more about that than I should probably. So, a slight vested interest, but conflict of interest, I won't talk about it. Thanks, panel. You have been amazing. I think everybody would like to thank the panel just briefly before we do questions. So, kind of the panel, I hope now have done the easy bit, which is to talk about the questions that we've been on. I've got a couple of questions from the audience already, and there might be some coming through, but I might be technically challenged, so I might be asking my colleagues to tell me what's coming through. One of the questions here is, the UK should be one of the best places to run a trial, but the practicalities of startup are still too difficult, and the system is often clogged up with competing things. What 3 things, panel, would you do to unlock the system? Ooh, who should I go to first? Claire.
Okay, what 3 things? The first is access to the data. So in Startup, one of the first things we do is we go out and we do our feasibility and we say, how many patients can you get, and how many patients can you get, and how many patients can you get? Well, come on, we've got a whole data source there that we should be able to have one person who goes out and says, you can get 10, you can get 5, and you can get 3. Do you agree or not? And then do you have the capability? Do you have the staffing to run this study? Those are the only 2 questions we should really be coming out to our sites with. No more than that, because we should know everything else. Everything else is available to us. So having the data organized and accessible to enable us to do that is probably the first thing. That would cut probably, I would say, about 8 weeks out of most studies, startup timelines. The second thing I think is we've made great strides in the UK, in all honesty, compared to other countries with our common budget templates and our common contracts that we have in sites. That has helped enormously, in actual fact, but I think it's still just timing and access to timing. We're still working with, the regulatory timelines and the ethics timelines, which are comparable to Europe, but we need to improve those. We really do. We need to find ways to capitalize on what we learned through the pandemic and really shorten those timelines for review. And then I think the final thing is to reduce some of the redundancy that we put in as an industry, and we're talking about this now as an industry. Some of the things that the hoops we make you all jump through are quite frankly ridiculous. We need to get a lot clever in the way that we start sites, so we don't need to come out to your site and have the PI sat in a room for an hour and everybody else an hour to start your site. There are much better and more effective ways to ensure that you have the information that you need to run that project successfully. I think the old-fashioned ways of, getting everybody in a room, it just adds time. It adds literally 2 weeks to organise that. And once you start taking off, 8 weeks for the feasibility, 2 weeks for the startup visit, and then the contract and the ethics timelines, and condense those, you're rapidly becoming, world-leading, in all honesty. So those are probably the 3 things that I would do. Very practical things, but those are them.
So I've got 2 more. Can I add 2 more?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So my first one is, and I'm obviously not a physician, and I'm a user of clinical research rather than, although I am a participant as well, is I would just actually embed in the compensation structure of physicians and hospitals and research nurses and so on, a active, positive benefit of leading clinical research. At the moment, clinical research I just don't think is nearly central enough in how we think about managing patients. So that's one. I would just change the compensation structure to reward people who actually take part in research. And then the second thing is I would just make it way more digital. So I'm part of the Novavax trial, and the amount of bits of paper is just ridiculous. And why it's not all electronic, I simply don't understand. And it's only going to lead to error. And there's no reason why the patients can't put in all their own data, as in all the sort of key things, and then get asked the different questions. They can get asked it electronically with a doctor and, asking them questions. But bits of paper and the pack, and I was complicated because I started off in the Royal Free, and then I was working out in Wales, and then when Wales prevented anybody from ever leaving, I then had to do my follow-up visits in Wales, so then all my papers had to get shipped to Cardiff, and literally my file was like this thick, and it's bizarre for such a straightforward vaccine trial. So I would get rid of the paper and make it all digital.
And indeed, these days you don't read the patient information sheet, you weigh it. But I'm saying that controversially because I'm going to come to June next, because I'm sure there's a regulatory aspect to all of this.
We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the law. Now, industry is always saying, don't make our system incompatible, inconsistent, but we can change and retain that compatibility. When I looked, we've set up a new group just to run through, before we consult, what should be in the law. The timelines and all this process stuff in the law, that's not necessary. Things around consent. We've already talked about new ways of perhaps pre-consenting large groups of people. Why should all these things be pre-specified? So we need flexible guidance that will run with innovations and a basic legal framework that's fit for the future. And please look out, because once we've done our job, we'll start to consult, probably November time, with the view to having the law in place in January. It would be bizarre if we were the only country left running to EU law when even Europe had stopped. So the point of whatever happened in the referendum was not to do that. So that's number one. The digital, totally agree. To an outsider, a certain amount of centralisation. Why researchers have to go everywhere to all these local committees and things when there could be some more centralised ethics, maybe. Let's talk about that. And the last bit is to pour a large amount of reassurance locally, I would say, because I've heard people saying, oh, the regulator wouldn't like that. Whereas in actual fact, we might not be bothered about that. So let's have a very reassuring, very positive, very enabled environment for research.
I think it's very interesting. I mean, I work in an area of pragmatic trials and digitally enabled trials. And many potential clients say, oh, we can't do that because the regulator won't let us do that. And I go, well, have you asked them? Well, no, but they'll say no. Yeah. Well, you could ask them, but they'll say no. Well, have you asked them? And you go around in this sort of terrible circle of well, if you ask them, they might say yes. Oh, well, that'll take time.
Risk proportionality.
Yeah, so
let's get it there.
Dinesh, you must have been on the receiving end of Claire's slide decks. Are there anything we can do from that point of view?
No, I think I would echo whatever has been said. I think sometimes the frustration for the investigator is he's got the patient ready to recruit, but the trial regulatory processes take a bit longer. And again, I agree with what June has said, having a centralized committee, because when I'm the CI for many studies, I'm called to all parts of the country to attend the ethics committee. So streamlining that would help. But I think coming back to this COVID point, the way that we've innovated with a trial like recovery. So for example, I practice in a city, 20% of my population do not have a working knowledge of English. And I'm excluding that community from taking part in trials. We've talked about inclusivity in trials. I've gone a long way in promoting 4 basic languages like Urdu, Punjabi, and getting them translated to enable those participants. Because the only way you're going to engage some of this community into research is to enabling them to get into research. Then they'll have a greater trust in when this is rolled out into practice. Because today, even though some of the treatments that have evolved or taken part in research in asthma, which have been 7 years down regulatory approval, participants from those communities are still worried about that. Unless we work with those communities to bring them into the fold and involve them in the research, they will then act as our ambassadors. So I think everything that you've said is really, really important, that we need to make these structures streamlined, but also make it much more friendly for the participants as well.
Thanks, guys. There are a whole load of questions on my phone, which I'm going to just see if I can select one that's quite a short question. Some people write a lot. And I'll get you off with one of the shorter ones. I think we've sort of asked this. How will MHRA continue to provide excellent support for UK clinical research at the same time as managing significant regulatory and structural change?
We are transforming as an agency really in the context of the life sciences vision, which means focusing on innovation, putting patients at the centre, being a vibrant regulator attuned to what's going on out in the research community. And that will entail a certain amount of downsizing. Having left the EU, we no longer have a large amount of EU participative work, but it will be a new structure for the benefits that will bring. And what we need is trust. Things like this discussion, I hope, help to build that your assets and your ideas will be in safe hands, that the iLab will work for you. We've had nearly 60 applications, innovation passports, maybe NIHR can look kindly on medicines with innovation passports, and then our whole system will really go from strength to strength. That's the way you can help us to transform.
Thank you. I've got one here which I quite like this question. I don't know who's going to answer it. Our company is looking to establish a European headquarters in the next few years. How can you help me argue the case for this to be based in the UK versus alternative EU countries? We're actually not an alternative EU country, are we? But you know what we mean.
Well, we built our companies out of preference in the UK versus the continent because from a sort of fiscal perspective, it's by far the most attractive place. From a clinical trial delivery, as we've talked about, it's the most attractive. We've got the best top universities in the world concentrated in the UK versus different European countries. And English is helpful because so we are close to the US and in terms of the likely partners of our companies. So it would be unlikely for us to mostly take our novel drugs to market. We will get through phase 2A, phase 2B, but we'd normally leave registration studies to the big pharma companies for any large indications. And I just think it's just much easier working with UK and our companies here. We've got sufficient numbers that there's a real ecosystem of entrepreneurs and innovators so that if one company goes down, which they always will, then actually those people can easily move to the next hot company, and that wouldn't be the same across the continent.
I'd add to that and say that the skill base in the UK is phenomenal compared with other European countries. We're very productive in terms of our productivity measures, and partnering with groups like the NIHR and that integration of research into the care system is really fundamental, and you don't get that in many countries to the level that we have it in the UK. We have very progressive regulators. But we do, it's true, when you look at other countries where, if you look at Brazil and India, where we had big booms in research, 5-10 years ago, and then we had some regulatory sort of instability, if you like. There was issues with pricing and sales, and those have literally dropped off the radar in terms of people placing research in those countries. So it's really fundamental that you have those two elements. But as you mentioned earlier, Martin, the skill base in the UK is phenomenal compared with other European countries.
So if I could just summarise the whole panel then. We have quality, we have quantity, we have data, we have this potential unique asset to join it all the way up from idea into everyday use and shorten that 17 years into, I don't know what, but a lot less than 17. I think you've had a really good exposition of how we have done that during the pandemic and how we're going to take the learning from that and do it over and over again in the future. And if you could speak with all of your company chief executives to get them to do all of their clinical research in the future in the UK, you can see that they will benefit from it. So thank you to the panel, thank you to yourselves. I hope you enjoyed the session.